Our next speaker is Nicole Hebert. Nicole was born in Calgary, Alberta, but grew up right here in Moose Jaw. She is a clinical social worker and is part of the Canadian Mental Health Association and Journey to Hope team in Moose Jaw for the past 4 years. She is currently working on a Voices of Hope initiative that starts conversations and connects community members by sharing their journeys with mental health. For Hope Summit 2020, Nicole has prepared a talk called It Comes in Waves, a focus on grief, loss, and self-compassion. As a previous Hope Summit speaker, I partnered with Nicole to support her through her journey, which was even more difficult with the pandemic situation and the associated precautions this year. I felt really lucky to be able to be on the other side of the support coach-speaker relationship this time around, and it was a joy to watch Nicole find the core of her story and flourish in the past couple months. Nicole, you've done amazing work. Thank you for sharing your story so generously with me and with all of us. Now, here's Nicole Hebert presenting It Comes in Waves.
It comes in waves. At least, that's what it felt like in the middle of the night, when I could feel my pain come crashing down as I slowly drift away into the silence of my dreams. I used to feel such fear and discomfort in the darkness and the stillness within myself. I learned that I would have to grow a level of familiarity, of comfort with my darkness, if I was ever going to find myself in the light. I suppose I should start where my childhood ended. I was 11 years old. It was my first time taking the city bus. I wanted to show my mom that I could handle this responsibility. And it was also exciting because it was something I was doing on my own, and I wasn't relying on anyone. I was 11 years old, and my childhood came to an abrupt halt after I was mugged at a bus stop by a family. I didn't know it then, but this experience would hold a footprint in my life for years to come, including my career. I never spoke about this much to my family, my friends. I never let them know how much it impacted my life, because I too led myself to believe the same thing. Because if the words could come out right, I wouldn't be suffocating on the fear that the moment my truth, my pain is heard, is the moment you turn your cheek. All I needed was a moment. It Comes in Waves is about my experience with adverse childhood experiences coupled with private logic, an inner dialogue that grew to hide and silence my voice. All I needed was a moment. And the private logic, a part of all of this, is that what I took when I was 11 years old was that if I wasn't perfect or calculated at all times, I should die. But all I needed was a moment. Was it bad enough yet? I asked myself. Am I worthy enough yet? Is the pain heavy enough yet? How will I know? The truth is, you won't know until you sit with it long enough to learn its name. Grief, loss, abandonment, confusion. Call me by my name, grief, and tell my story so that it can be heard. I want my childhood back, and I want this fear to go away. All I needed was a moment. As I see it now, a lot of this pain also came from a place of compassion and love. Compassion for the children that had to watch the family have their way with us. It was startling to notice that they were the same age as me, it was even more devastating that nobody stopped to help us. I learned a deeper level of fear that day, coupled with helplessness, knowing that I would have to endure this, that no help was coming to save us from this soon-to-be heartache. And I was heartbroken for a long time. Fast forward to the first few years of my career, and I was faced with similar truths, only I was much older now. Call me by my name, grief, and tell my story so that it can be heard. I want the person I once was back. I want it to return to my mind and my body. I'm angry that I no longer recognize the person that I once was staring back at me in this mirror. How dare you ask if I had healthy boundaries, if my work-life balance was strong? These two phrases are very common to hear and be asked about in a social work career, next to burnout. They're also heavily associated with disproportionate timing and judgment. I felt very alone and undeserving of being understood, not deserving of time to get help. Because how I felt was just grief and sadness. Sadness for the fact that I now had to say goodbye to someone in my life, which was the greatest loss of my life, because I had to say goodbye to myself, because I put my work on a pedestal and I put my life in a tiny box. I lost myself, and I suffered for this. I can't get out. I can never get out. The next most common phrase that I would hear is, yeah, but you don't work there anymore. Sure, I don't work there. This is true. This is factual. This is also a grounding sentence that I learned to use while I had a brief series of therapy. And the focus was with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the therapy in which you learn about your thoughts, how they work, and how they can impact you. And then, of course, how to work through that. And along with that, I learned this phrase, that was then, and this is now. The thing with that phrase is, honestly, mentally, you never leave the type of work that I was doing before. You can't. It's all around you. Everywhere you go, you're reminded of the work that you did, because it's so heavily embedded into the community that you work for and with so tirelessly every day. You can't go and get help because you work heavily and close by all of the support networks in the community. And it's not that I ever felt that my privacy or my confidentiality would be disrespected, but it was the visual recall of going to get help and the support services that I could have accessed, and seeing this person's face, and then having to see them in another place as well, and not ever being able to separate the two, not being able to leave the discussion of my trauma in the chair that I would have sat in, and closing the door behind me after each session, because unfortunately I would have to see the same person in my line of work. I can't get out. I can never get out. Call me by my name, grief, and tell my story so that I can be heard. I want my words and my memory back. I'm angry that I can no longer recognize the sound of my voice. The first thing that I noticed that went for me after I started going into the spiral of heavy anxiety and depression coupled with PTSD-like symptoms was that my vocabulary and my memory were just gone. I developed a temporary stutter, and which went away. A lot of that I learned had to do with the shame I felt. The fact that you work in a line of work where you constantly have to second guess yourself, so you never really know if what you're saying is what is really happening. which is a whole different level of devastation in itself, if you're not careful. And I noticed that I could see what I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come out. Nothing made sense, and therefore I couldn't ask for help. I couldn't put it into words. All I could do was run. And I was so angry by this because I couldn't talk with people the way that I knew I was good, that I was proud of being able to do. I was very good at conversing with people. I loved doing it. Even in the most intense situations, I found it so important to find the humanness in those situations, because that's what matters. In losing some of these skills, it also compromised some of my memory and being able to organize, which then made me very angry because I value other people's time as much as I value my own. And so when that started to slip, I felt very ashamed and isolated. I learned that so much time passed in my suffering that I then could flip it on myself and realize the importance of time. So I really caution people to take your time. I spent many months suffering in silence, watching the replay of faces, events, things that I'd seen, and I felt very alone. I was on a lifeboat, but nobody was coming to get me. I can't get out, I'd say. I can never get out. My mom looked at me confused because a moment before this, she found me staring at a wall that happened to be the same color as the walls at my work, which then kept leading me to believe that when I was at work, I was at home, and when I was at home, I was at work. These are some things that I experienced along with others that included jumping at the slightest sound, being extremely hypervigilant. I would almost say for myself, I felt paranoid, though I know the proper term is hypervigilant. I felt scared. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling overwhelmed and trapped, and then the guilt would replay. I can't get out. I can never get out. I learned from these pieces that these were symptoms of PTSD, though I never went and really got assessed. I learned through a brief series of counseling that I was experiencing PTSD-like symptoms coupled with heavy burnout. And it was really hard for me because I then had to work on caring and understanding myself, while all at the same time not being able to do any of those things. It was heartbreaking. But all I needed was time. And I was praying too. I was praying someone saw I was drowning, but nobody saw. That was even more heartbreaking. Because honestly, if I could calm the cries of the children that I couldn't get to in time, and if I could have held the parents a little longer and carried the weight a little bit farther, then maybe they wouldn't be haunting my dreams at night. I can't get out. But all I need is a moment. Call me by my name, anger, and tell my story so that I can be heard. If I'm not perfect, then someone will die. I referred to private logic earlier in my talk, which discusses my experience with this private logic and why it's so important. Because we do have an inner dialogue, regardless if we notice it at the surface or if we only notice it in moments. My private logic when I was 11, what I took away from that situation was that if I wasn't perfect and calculated every moment of every day, I should die because I must be perfect. And then eventually with this work that I was doing, the responsibility shifted. though the responsibility was still on myself, it included everyone else. If I wasn't perfect, if I wasn't calculated, if I don't do this right, someone will die. Because I'm responsible for everyone. Because the work that I did, it's essentially what it was. We are responsible. Because if I could just calculate every second of every breath that I take, then nothing adversely scary will ever happen because I will be perfect. And because I'm perfect, I'm worthy enough to live. All I need is a moment. If I could just sit with my darkness, I'd say, if I could just sit there for a little while and listen, then maybe the quietness, the stillness in my life wouldn't be such a terrifying place for my mind and my spirit. There was a moment that I had to be honest with myself and where I was at, and that was accepting who I was in the moment that I realized I was in a place I didn't want to be in anymore. I was angry all the time. And eventually this got me to a very dark place. And in that place, I remember just sitting there. I sat watching the bottle of vodka, and I had a handful of pills that I just eventually curled up and put towards my chest. And I remember being able to feel everything all at once, every movement in my body. And I sat there for a while, for what seemed like an eternity, just trying to catch up with myself. And eventually I was able to relax my shoulders and begin to accept the heaviness of what I was feeling. My work let me down. My career let me drown. I lost myself, and I didn't like the person that was left behind. And after a few moments, I released my hands. And through sobs, I was finally able to start releasing the vodka down the sink. And for every ounce, I promised myself this: I would accept myself regardless of whether or not I recognized the person staring back at me. That I would never take that moment for granted. That I would never take myself for granted. Because eventually, I knew that enough time would pass, enough light would shine, that eventually I could step out from the shadows and the darkness. I no longer had to ask myself, was it heavy enough yet? Was I worthy enough yet? Was it bad enough yet? How do I know? Because by then enough time would have passed that a light would have shined, and eventually I'd be able to find myself in that light. But all I need is a moment. And I definitely received it. You know, the most empowering thing that anyone ever did for me was to hold space for compassion, to take the time to be present, and without judgment, without direction, to just accept, and to choose to understand me even when I didn't understand myself. My coworkers, both past and present, were really good for this. They They allowed space for me to grow. They chose to understand me and they didn't have to. They chose to take the time to listen and be present with me when I couldn't be present with myself. And it got me thinking that it's so doable to do that, to practice this, to model compassion, to model love, regardless if you agree with someone or understand what they're going through. It's so important that we hold that space for people because it's life-saving. My coworkers didn't have to do that for me. They didn't have to try to understand me, but they did anyway. They didn't have to try to help me through everything and listen, but they did anyway. And it saved my voice and it saved my life. So I've also had so many influences in my life. I owe an immense amount of thank yous, but there'll never be enough. Aside from my family and friends and the wonderful opportunities that I've been blessed to have throughout my life, I really do owe a thank you and an honor, and a humble honor to the Saskatchewan theatre community. They've always been a positive outlet for me. They have given me a place to exist and be when I couldn't exist and be with myself. And there's not enough words to express my thanks. And I'm very thankful. And among these influences, I came across mentors from all over Canada. And a lot of them had a similar theme. Nicole, the moment something means something to you, the moment something becomes something in your life, is the moment that you feel the most fear. Run, collide, be one with that fear. The night I made my attempt, I have to acknowledge, because it's important, that though there was a lot of pain and darkness in that time, there was also so much love and compassion. Because if I look at it now, that's what it was. The love for the work that I do, the love for myself, the love for the humbling experiences and people that I met under many different lights. And I was scared that night because it would have been the first time that I chose myself. Because the greatest loss in my life was myself, and now I'm choosing myself and accepting myself. And I chose to just collide, run towards, and just be. Because all I needed was a moment. I've learned that it's my responsibility and my responsibility alone to calm the waves. It's no one else's job. That if I lead through compassion and love, that if I hold space for myself to be present with my feelings, that I'm also providing myself a place of safety, love, forgiveness. I'm providing a path for healing, hope, and recovery. And I can also model this for others. I can listen, I can be present, because all we need is a moment. Because at the end of the day, we are so worthy of time. We are so worthy of love and kindness to ourselves. We don't hear it enough. We have to create it for ourselves, and that's the hard part. That's how we calm the waves. It's the best form of love we could give for ourselves, and it's so needed. What's more important, I guess, to me, is that people understand that you're here. You're here for a reason. We feel what we feel, and how we feel matters, always. No one can justify that. No one but ourselves. And that's where we embody that step to healing, to safety, to comfort. It's not about controlling. It's not about having power over anything. It's about existing. It's about being human without having to check off a list every time. Because you are here. And that's enough. It's enough that I'm even here. I may not agree with myself every day, but the fact that I can wake up and love and accept the person staring back at me, regardless of where I am, regardless of who I am that day, is enough. Call me by my name, worth, and tell my story so that I can be heard. You've always been enough. How you feel matters. You were enough the moment that your heartbeat began and your purpose came alive in this world, so that the rest of the world could walk a little brighter from the reflection of your light. You belong here. Thank you.